Hello everybody, time for Sunday school. Thank you for joining me, and we'll go through the lesson and be ready for it next Sunday morning. This lesson is for October 25. It's entitled God Renews, and it's from Isaiah 40 verses 18 through 31. Our theme is God provides strength for those who trust in Him. This is a pretty good lesson this week, and I hope that you will take the time to read it and read the text and maybe even read it 2 or 3 times. I was reading a theology book this week, and they were quoting C.S. Lewis, and they quoted his literary background rather than his theological background, and they were saying that Lewis was teaching back at the time of World War II, that you have to read the text and reread it and read it and just keep reading it, because that's how you get the tenor and tone of the text. And so I want to encourage you to do that. Read your lesson several times and read the scriptural text several times as well. Now, the background for this is that in Isaiah chapter 40, we come to a change in the book of Isaiah. Bible scholars, commentaries, books of all sorts will make a note that Isaiah makes a major change in chapter 40. And the verses we're looking at tonight happen to be foundational for the rest of the book. Now, as you just read through it, you may or may not notice that change, but I know on one occasion I was reading Isaiah and noticed very clearly that 40 and following is different than the first 39 chapters. Now, I'm not going to deal a lot with that. You just need to know it's there. You're in a new section of Isaiah, a good section, and this change starts here in chapter 40. Now, if you will begin in chapter 40 rather than going to verse 18, you'll find the background that you need that helps make our selected passages for this lesson, helps make them more sensible. You can understand where you're going. The beginning of chapter 40 is the promise of comfort for God's people. And then verse 6, we have the word of the Lord which stands forever. And then in verse 9, and that really is a good start for this lesson, is the greatness of God. And he goes on telling about how wonderful and great God is. And then we get to the text, which is chapter 40, verse 18. And we begin with a question, with whom will you compare God? Well, he's already been talking about how great and wonderful God is. If you're using the Sunday School Quarterly, then you will find that under the Understand the Context section, you're going to get a long list of the attributes of God, or some attributes of God, certainly not all, but attributes of God and actions of God. And our lesson writer tells us that everything Isaiah said, he premises on the truth that there is only one God. And that's the background to this section. One God, a great and powerful God. And he also concludes, our writer concludes, God will manifest his sovereignty over all humanity by love and not by compulsion. We have a God that loves us and tries to reach out to us. He does not force us to follow him. We do this as a response to his love towards us. Now let's look at the text. It's verse 18 through 20 is the first section. There's 3 sections for this lesson. With whom will you compare God? What likeness will you set up for comparison with him? An idol? Something that a smelter casts and a metal worker plates with gold and makes silver chains for? A poor person contributes wood for a pedestal that will not rot. He looks for a skilled craftsman to set up an idol that will not fall over. What we have here are a series of questions in this section and in the 2 that follow. And that's one of the techniques Isaiah is using. He's asking questions, rhetorical questions, or questions placed in a series to help us to get the message that he's wanting to give to us. And we begin with one right here. With whom will you compare God? And then he goes on to offer a suggestion that people have been doing. They've been engaged in idolatry. And obviously they're saying that this God is better than this God. And so he's simply asking the question, with whom will you compare God? Idolatry was a major problem in the Old Testament and still is today, although it's expressed in many different ways, maybe more today than then. But idolatry was a major problem, and it is spoken against throughout the Old Testament. I was reading in Exodus just a little while ago, And I was amazed as I read through, particularly in the Christian Standard Version, that as the people were at the base of Horeb and Moses was up on the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments, he was gone for 40 days and 40 nights. And so the people got together and said, make us an idol, make us a calf, make us a god, and we will say that this is the God who brought us out of Egypt. And as you read it in that modern translation, the absurdity of the whole process really comes through. What? There was no calf involved. You can't make up something that you can say, well, this was our God who did this for us. And you just really see the stupidity of the people. And you see how idolatry is such a horrible thing. When God did it and worked many wonderful miracles, the crossing of the Red Sea, the plagues in Egypt, and then they say, this calf did it. It makes no sense whatsoever. And so what we're seeing here is a comparison. Would you compare God to some idol that has been made? And the obvious answer is no, you should not do that. Part of the humor, if you want to call it humor here, in the 20th verse, is that the people look for a craftsman to set up an idol that will not fall over. Do you mean the God that they're serving, that they've made, that they've created, can't even stand on its own pedestal and has to be propped up? The lesson makes the point that the silver chain that is on the idol could be either a decorative item, but more likely it was what tied the idol down to the pedestal. And I just find it a bit ironic that they would serve a God that can't even hold himself up. And I think maybe Isaiah is trying to tell us that as well. Now the lesson is interrupted right here. And the interruption is a good place for the key doctrine, which is God. To God we owe the highest love, reverence, and obedience. And the reference is to 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 17. And so our doctrinal statement for this lesson is that we would truly understand who God is. So that's why we might want to read this section 2 or 3 times, just to get that tone, to get that understanding of what the text is trying to say to us. I think too that when you look at these idols, it may be that also idolatry is an expression of humanity. In many ways, as people had needs, human needs, they would create these idols, whether it be a calf or some other god, and then they would worship them, but they were expressions of human need. And they weren't expressions of God coming to man, but rather man creating God. A couple of examples would be as folks began to plant crops and they were dependent upon the fertility of the land and of their herds and flocks. So they created gods that would ensure that they would have good crops and lots of animals. And so they projected back upon God their human needs. Another might be seafaring people who were out on the seas and out on the Mediterranean and out on the Sea of Galilee. The storms would come up and the waves would come. And so they created a god of the seas, in order to have protection when they were out on the waters. And so that's one of the problems with idolatry too. It's really an expression of human need rather than a reality that there's a great God who is the creator God who loves us and, as we know, sacrificed his son for us. And so it is a direct opposite of what faith in a true God really is. We have another break in the lesson, and it's time here for the Bible skills section. And he says to compare passages with a similar theme. And so listed for us are Job chapter 12 and Romans chapter 1. And I would encourage you to do that. Look these passages up. They're similar in theme and scope to what we have here. And I think what that shows us is unity of Scripture. The Bible doesn't say one thing in the Old Testament, another thing in the New Testament. It doesn't change the theology. It is consistent. There is a single story. And that is a big theme in theology these days called biblical theology. It's gone through a radical change over the last several years. And I think it's fascinating, it's wonderful, and it's what we should be looking for. What's God speaking throughout the whole Bible? And so we can work on that as we look at other scriptures that help us to understand this scripture, because God's message doesn't change. The second section has to do with the sovereign creator. And again, it starts with questions. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not considered the foundations of the earth? God is enthroned above the circle of the earth. Its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, so small and insignificant to the greatness of God. Now, a little Bible skill here is there are 4 questions there in verse 21, and those questions are purposefully designed and structured, and they're called a chiasm. And what that means is the first question, if you give it the designation A, it's followed by a B, and then you repeat the process in reverse. The next question is the B, stated in a slightly different way, and then that's followed by the A, that's stated in a slightly different way. And so what you have is an A, B, B, A. And typically in the Bible, when you see this, it's the middle section that is the emphasis, and then the 2 outer questions that give additional information and support. And so what we want to see here is, what is this point? The point is, have you not heard? And has it not been declared to you from the beginning? And the answer is, of course they have heard. And of course they have been recipients of this information. I think it would be a whole lot like people today who grow up and then they stray from the church. In fact, at one point I saw a graph or a chart or something that showed how many people were leaving Baptist churches. But it wasn't just leaving Baptist churches for Methodist or Presbyterian or some other church. They were leaving altogether, leaving the church, leaving faith. And I believe that when there's a time of judgment, God might just simply look at them and say, have you not heard? Didn't you hear from the beginning? Well, when did they hear? Sunday school, vacation Bible school, sermons from the pastor. The message is there and it's clear. And yet people have turned against God. And that's what he's dealing with here. Have you not heard? And then he moves to a section that includes natural theology. Natural theology is when you look at nature and things that are normal and natural, and you find the presence of God in them. Right now, as I'm speaking to you, it's already dark. And if you go outside, you'll look up at about a quarter moon. It's one of those crescent moons, and it's clear and it's beautiful. And you look at it and say, wow, there must be a God. In a few minutes, the stars will be out in full force. And you look at this and you see that which is in nature, and you recognize that there truly is a God. And that's what he's doing here. He's speaking about God as he understood him in nature, in his own world. And we can do the same. Now be careful. Don't go too far or you worship nature. We don't want to do that. More about that in just a moment. Then he moves to politics, and he talks about how princes can be made or undone in a moment's time. And it reminded me that we're in a time of election, and I'm fairly certain, although I'm not a political person very much at all, that this election will undo some politician, whether it's the one that's in office or the one that's not in office. Whoever loses, their political career is probably over. They might resurge, but probably over. And so what we see is if we have a faith in God that's invested and interested in our nation and in who rules us, then we can see that a man could be made in an instant, but he could be brought down in an instant. And we need to see the hand of God in that. And then he comes back to idolatry. He says, and he's talking about the stars. So it seems like we're back to natural theology. But what we learn from other passages is that people in Isaiah's time actually worshiped stars. And they attributed them as to be gods. And so when he says, look at the stars, who created these? What he's saying is, I am God, these are not. And he goes on to say that God knows the stars by number and calls them by name. And because of his great power and strength, not one of them is missing. God is greater than all these supposed gods that the people are projecting and trying to serve. So now we move on to the last section, and it's entitled Tireless Source. Jacob, why do you say, and Israel, why do you assert my way is hidden from the Lord? Now he's talking about the whole of Israel, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And you say that my claim is ignored by God. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting Lord, the creator of the whole earth. And he never becomes faint or weary, and there's no limit to his understanding. He gives strength to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Our writer really said this well, so I'm just going to read it from the text. The grammar conveys a continual complaining. The folks are complaining to God that he doesn't hear them or pay attention. There's a hint of sarcasm as they called him my God. In other words, supposedly you are my God, but what good are you to me if you refuse to listen to me? The irony should not be lost to the reader. The God who continually sent Israel his prophets, gave them his word, dwelt among them, and saved them on numerous occasions, was told by this people, who hardly ever listened to him, that he was ignoring them. And sometimes that's how we treat God, as if he is the one that's absent when it is us. Well, then he moves on, and the text continues in verses 29 and 31, or through 31. And what we find here is a promise of rejuvenation for people who will come back to God. God's people, they can be strengthened and renewed. Rejuvenated, they will have renewed strength, hope in the future, and strength for the present. And then what we have is one of the most popular or well-known verses, I think, in the Old Testament. But those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not become weary. They will walk and not faint. In a time frame when there's confusion all around us in every level of our life. I was listening on the radio today, people were talking about it, how things are just really a mess. It is in these times for those people who will call upon the Lord. He does hear, and he renews us, and indeed he makes us like the eagles, and we'll soar on wings like eagles, run and not become weary, walk and not faint. A good word for people who turn to God in faith. God bless you. Hope to see you on Sunday.